So thank you all for choosing our session. As they say in American Airlines, you all had your choice of companies and you chose us to be with us. So between India, what was Latin America and China, you chose to be here with us at ASEAN in China. My name is Grace Osic. I'm a faculty here at Marshall School of Business. I've been teaching classes in supply chain management, sustainable supply chain, and sourcing. And it's more important that we have some very interesting guests here with us who will introduce themselves soon. And I'm looking forward to hearing and learning from them so that I get some more material to use in my courses. So I'm sure they will do much better job in introducing themselves than I can. So can you please just say something about yourself and your companies? So Mike.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Lauderman, and I'm here representing Li and Fung. My name is Mike Lauderman. I'm here representing Li and Fung Trading. It's a Hong Kong-based company. I've lived in Hong Kong for the past 25 years. I actually did my undergrad here at SC, and I've been working for Li and Fung for about 11 years. I sold my company to them about 11 years ago, and have stuck with the company like many of the executives there. We've brought a lot of our senior guys in through acquisitions. I don't know if most of you, I assume, are somewhat familiar with Li and Fung. They're a kind of a household name in supply chain, and look forward to some good questions and some good feedback from you guys. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Richard Sternberg. I'm with Shanghai Consulting. We do two things primarily. One is the classical sourcing, engineering, manufacturing support for clients in China. And the other is helping U.S. companies sell U.S.-made products into the China market. We work primarily with B2B companies, kind of niche companies that don't go through major distributors. They need customized sales team in China. And we offer what we call an incubator sales model, helping companies get their initial sales foothold in China and then release them once they're up and running to go as they may to develop and expand their business. I like to say that I try to keep a carbon neutral footprint on global trade by playing both sides of the coin there. But thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Yormark. I am a longtime professor in the Department of Data Science and Operations. It's changed its name over the years. Call it Operations Management if you like. I've done teaching in a lot of the different areas here. I've watched the supply chain area grow and grow exponentially in the last decade, perhaps. And I've taught a lot in Southeast Asia. I have a lot of interest in the area, and so I'm here to present a academic perspective, if you will, on what I see is happening in Southeast Asia and China in particular.
So to start with, could you tell us a little bit about what are some of the unique issues that you think your supply chains are facing, both when sourcing from Asia and China and also when selling there? Because as I understand, both of your companies also selling in China.
That was for me?
Yeah.
So the question, the challenges that we face. So, you know, we every 3 years, Li and Fung, they reset their business plan, and it's zero-based planning, and we kind of look at what's going to happen over the next 3 years, and we look at what we think is going to be happening 3 years from now, paint ourselves into that scenario, and then kind of determine how we get there. So some of the things that we're kind of looking at is going to be big factors going forward, and we have challenges now, are compliance, responsible sourcing. Ever since Rana Plaza and Tazareen, the tragedies in Bangladesh, it's really shaken the industry up. And I was telling Grace earlier that it really went from, 10 years ago we used to sit, they have the round tables internally and talk about stuff. And there was nothing ever really actioned. You'd leave the room feeling good, like, yeah, we're going to be responsible, we're going to source compliantly, we're going to work ethically. You leave the room and nothing really happened. And really, fundamentally, that's changed in the last 2 years since the tragedy. And big corporations, customers, brands, retailers, everybody's now behind it, and they're really looking to make fundamental changes. And it's happening, and it's certainly not easy. But in the apparel side, they have the Coalition and the Accord, which are the European and the U.S. versions of the same, basically, agreement between retailers and brands that are changing the industry and making it really a much safer for the worker and much more socially responsible for the whole supply chain. With that, I think one of the big changes is transparency that's really changing in our industry. It's no longer okay not to know where your goods are produced. Still one of the big problems is subcontracting. It's still a challenge, even for a company like Li & Fung. We have 30,000 employees, around in the factories, and it's still a challenge for us. So imagine companies that really don't have boots on the ground, trying to control and understand the transparency in their supply chain. And that's something that I think everybody will continue to struggle with and be challenged with. We're challenged with the speed, the proliferation of the need for speed of our customers. I'll take a term that I was just meeting some Walmart executives, and that one of the terms that they like to use now is they want to win at the intersection of digital and physical. So it's this whole cross-section now. It's not going to be all physical. It's not going to be all digital. What these executives believe there's going to be somewhere in between where people are going to be winning the business and being able to keep up with the speed of the new economy, that's being caused by the internet and all these things. And probably the last thing that we're really struggling with, and we see big challenges, is innovation. It's something that I've seen living in China for the past 25 years. Very great at copying things. You give them something, you say you want to make it. They make it cheap. They make it great. They make it on time. The quality is great, but they're missing that innovation. And traditionally, that's really come from more the U.S. Side of the supply chain where the innovation's coming. But I think the challenge is how do you start nurturing the innovation in Asia? And I think that's going to be a big leap for companies like ours because the customers are now really looking at us to provide a lot of the innovation. It's not only coming from the customer now, it's got to be coming from the supplier side and the factory side. The innovation's got to be things. So those are some of the key things that I think are going to be challenging us now and for the near term for sure.
Okay, we come from a little different perspective. We don't work really with multinational companies, large corporations. Our client base is small and medium-sized companies. So it's no surprise that labor and prices in China are going up. That's well understood. Wages in China go up an average of 8 to 13% a year. And so for a lot of the factories we use and have used, they're starting to close down. They can't sustain that kind of wage level. And a lot of that work is moving out of China into some of the other countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia. And so for our clients and some of our factories, finding new factories or trying to find creative ways to keep these factories in business is one of the challenges. And so that's probably our biggest challenge on the sourcing side. On the selling into China side, which is another angle, again with small and medium-sized companies, we still run into resistance for companies trying to sell into the China market. There's a lot of obstacles, and they get tougher and tougher for us. A lot of the website access that we use to run our small business, even access to Google, it gets tightened and tightened. We can't use Chinese search engines for what we do. So those are some of the challenges we're facing as we go forward for the next 2 to 3 years. We're seeing those as significant.
John, you want to make that point?
I got lots of them. The biggest, or one of the biggest trends we see, of course, was mentioned previously, and that has to do with urbanization, because I'm going to sort of pull it up a little higher level and take a look at things perhaps at a 10,000-foot level. The urbanization of 1 billion people in China and the urbanization of hundreds of millions throughout Southeast Asia is a major economic shift and a major economic force. To imagine China actively making sure that that its population moves into a relatively small number of very large and concentrated urban areas is a totally new concept. Somebody's going to engineer that particular social shift. No one's quite sure how that's going to happen. I'm not sure the Chinese quite understand. But the implications are huge as we go from roughly 48% of the world living in cities to something more like 2/3 of the world living in cities. The implications are very, very large. The most obvious one is the one that comes home to roost in the supply chain first and foremost, and that's infrastructure. China in particular and Southeast Asia in general has put in place over the last 15 years probably the most massive investment in infrastructure that has ever been seen on the planet. And that infrastructure doesn't even begin to approach what is needed for the future. So the road networks that are required to link these urban areas, the creativity and innovation that's going to be required to make all that work in the face of huge numbers of people is going to be a very interesting thing to see. China is building out a massive railroad network, which is quite interesting because that massive rail network is actually very sophisticated and is going to be able to support high-speed trains, and suddenly going to see use of railroads in a very, very different way than has ever been seen on the planet before. And then comes the question of what happens when you have a very small number of cities of the order of 50 million people in China. How does everybody move around? How does everybody get from A to B, and how do the goods get from A to B? It's going to be quite interesting to see. So if you have a city cluster like that, moving things on the surface is one thing. What about what moves below the surface? And so all of the infrastructure needed to support 50 million people all in one place becomes a rather daunting idea. Water supply, sewers, novel concept, and power to support that many people. Apart from the economic benefit of trying to outfit all that infrastructure, just how you designed it, no one's quite sure. The second major issue is what happens as China's, as the 800-pound gorilla in the area, as China begins to mature and the massive manufacturing infrastructure that has been built up starts to mature and starts to scale up. And the natural forces at work push labor supply up and pushes business to other areas throughout Southeast Asia. So that's a good thing, but how that shifts and how everyone adapts to it is going to be a very interesting thing to see. And I've got a whole bunch more, but I'm sure they'll show up in a little bit.
So do we have any questions about this, this part from the audience? No, we have more questions. So we have heard before, it was mentioned in one of the previous presentations, how, well, supply chains have been here present for thousands of years. What we've seen in the last decade or two was a significant revolution in terms of technology advances and how it impacted supply chains. So can you tell a little bit something about how technology changes impact in your supply chains and your businesses?
I'm certainly not a technology expert, so I can really only relate to the general connectivity with our customers and our networks and how that's working. You know, that's obviously all related to speed and accuracy, and you know, the ease of working with, you know, buyers and merchants and our collaborators on the other side of the ocean. There is one technology that it's actually an old technology, RFID. And we've made a strategic investment in a company, and I'll describe the technology, just kind of I'll paint you a little picture of it. It's called CatLook, and what it is, you know, all the apparel is tagged with the RFID, and that's not new or anything. But what happens now is in the store level, the register area, the dressing rooms are all wired. So you go, you take your sample or your piece of garment into the dressing room, and up on the mirror flashes a picture of you basically, and you can change colors. It fits you with the piece of garment that you brought into the fitting room. You can go and do Facebook on the screen to see who's looking at this same apparel, maybe something that goes with it, a hat, a belt. It's all these things. It's giving you information inside the dressing room. You can call an assistant, a shopping assistant from in there, and get some advice or some help. And that's all novel, and it's pretty cool stuff. But I'd say what's really interesting for the retailers, and we're now supplying this technology to retailers, and they're just testing it, is they can actually see what was taken off the shelf or off the rack, and what's gone into the fitting room, and then what was put back and what was purchased. So they have some now data. They understand what the conversion rate is on each garment, real time. So they can see if there's a problem. If they can see, 100 dresses have gone into the dressing room and 100 dresses have been put back on the rack, there's something wrong, and they get feedback immediately. So these are the type of things we're investing in the future, and we think are interesting technologies. But maybe these guys can speak a little bit more about the area, more than I can.
Well, likewise, I'm not a technology expert in this area. And again, we're small and medium-sized companies, so we're struggling with, and our factories are struggling with a lot of the technology issues that are 5, 8, 10 years old. If it's barcoding or labeling, or having just an inventory management system, or planning and scheduling. A lot of factories that we've seen have bought into some of these packages, maybe not knowing what they were buying, maybe not fully believing in it, and then once it was implemented, it really wasn't a good fit for what they were doing, and they either abandoned it for lack of interest, but they held it up on a plaque on the wall for part of their sales program. It just wasn't a good fit. They were sold something maybe it shouldn't be. A lot of these packages, technology that we've seen in the smaller factories, if you get a management change, then the incentive to follow that program and not go back to a spreadsheet or something a little bit more fundamental is strong, and it's quicker and it's easier for factories to respond using that technique. So those have been on the technology side on that end. On the other end, on the e-commerce side, we're seeing that open up, and Alibaba's done a great job of opening up China, and that's just at the cutting edge and we're just seeing the beginning of that, where e-commerce will dominate China in the next 5 to 7 years. And that's a new technology. It's new for the Chinese. Everybody's got, 70% of the people have a smartphone, a computer, or a tablet. So that technology is becoming more and more apparent in China, and helping clients that we work with sell consumer goods into the China market.
I thought it's very interesting. As of last year, the total volume of e-commerce in China surpassed that of the United States. Not by much, but a little bit. So suddenly China becomes the major player in e-commerce, and it's exploding. And that's, of course, on the buy side. All right. What's even more interesting is the lack of technology infrastructure and technology development among the businesses that are supplying those buyers. It seems very clear why you would see e-commerce exploding in China. What will be more interesting is to see how businesses cope with delivering those goods. If you have very high density cities, you have the opportunity to try out some very, very interesting ways to deliver goods into the hands of the individual consumer, but you can hope to see a tremendous amount of innovation and leveraging cultural differences and infrastructure differences to see how you go and deliver the goods, put them in the hands of the customers in a place like China. The growth of RFID will be rather interesting to watch. One of the top supply chain players is a company called Inditex. You saw that on the chart that we looked at for one of the speakers today. That company is the parent company of Zara. Zara is one of the most respected players on the planet and is a major player in apparel, retail apparel. They have just implemented a very interesting program that uses RFID tags at the actual retail level. So that is, every single garment has an RFID tag on it. I think they are the first to do that on the kind of scale that a company like Zara is able to do it. One of the principal issues, of course, is that the RFID tags are very expensive. Zara, because it's so tightly vertically integrated, puts their RFID tags on each garment at the same time that they put a price tag on each garment at their central distribution center. And so they send out the garments with the RFID tags attached to their own stores. And so when a garment gets sold, they clip off the RFID tag, toss it into a bin, and then recycle them. So suddenly their costs to implement RFID tags goes way down. And they are rolling out a huge operation in which they can truly provide an example of the power of visibility in the supply chain, because they will now know where every item is, when it gets sold, where it comes from, how long it was on the shelf, and be able to even more tightly manage the matching of supply to demand, as well as as was mentioned by a previous speaker, as well as molding that demand based on artificial scarcity and a few other things that Inditex is a master of. So those are, I think, major trends. But the thing to be most interesting to see, what happens with the digitalization of businesses in China, because that is a huge undertaking and is very, very difficult. It's one thing for a consumer to sit with an iPad type device or a phone or a laptop or whatever it is and place an order, click, click, and we're done. The real issue is how does the supply chain respond, and how do you produce an integrated supply chain that's matched with infrastructure and third-party suppliers and so on in China? That's going to be a real challenge.
John, just a little bit of local pride. I think actually American Apparel did it before Zara, but perhaps not at so efficient level and at such a low cost. Our local guys here from LA. Mike, when we talked earlier, you also mentioned that your company is interested in 3D printing. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's 3D printing. It's one of our honorary chairman, Dr. Victor Fong. It's kind of one of his pet projects, and you can't sit in a meeting without him bringing up 3D printing. In fact, we have one, and I think in almost all of our offices now in Shanghai, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, New Delhi, all our major hubs, we have them. And to be honest, I get it, and I understand what he's talking about, the opportunity. At this point, it's more of a pet than a reality. We're using it in our health and beauty division. We have a large health and beauty department, and we use it for developing prototypes for those beautiful perfume bottles that we do for Estee Lauder and Kate Spade and all those things, because it's instantaneous and it's the buyers can touch and feel it, and you can play around with it quite easily with a 3D printer. So we're using it now for really prototyping samples and speed and accuracy of these prototypes. And the reality is a cost. To make a hand tool to make a prototype is expensive, and these 3Ds are instantaneous, they're accurate, and they're relatively inexpensive. So it remains to be seen. And I manage our global Walmart business, so I spend a lot of time in Bentonville working with their executives, and they're certainly looking at it, how to commercialize the thing. I'm sure some of you have read about Disney. They're playing around with having 3D printers in their stores, in the Disney stores, and they're using it at a consumer level. And I'm not sure what the early feedback is. It seems a little bit gimmicky at this point. I don't know where it's going to go, but a lot of people envision, someday, in somewhere in China, we walk into a factory and it's 5,000 3D printers, and that's all that's in there. That could be the future. We'll have to wait and see.
Thank you. So moving away from the, oh, yes?
Hey, Michael, I want to just digress for a second.
Yeah.
ASEAN free trade that goes into effect next year.
Yeah.
What is the outlook on the wind farm sector?
The TPP?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then also, is that, and the second part of the question is, the China plus strategy will have some impact on the outlook of ASEAN, and if so, also.
I think all the multilateral and bilateral agreements have some relevance. Depends where you're doing business. We look at all of them. The TPP is obviously, forefront right now, and the opportunities for Vietnam and some of these other more emerging production countries. It's something we certainly study and we're looking at, and we think that there's going to be some advantages, but it's an even playing field, so we don't say this is going to be an advantage for Li and Fung. It's going to be an advantage for the consumers, the end users, the retailers, and we just kind of wait and see what happens there. The China plus one strategy, obviously it's an old strategy. People are kind of panicked, at the beginning of this China's last 5-year plan. They came out and said, we're going to raise the minimum wage 13.5% every year for the next 5 years. It wasn't a secret, right? So everybody knew that they had to make adjustments, and China was changing. And I think that it was a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction by some people. I mean, China's going to continue to be relevant. What can be moved out of China, in reality, started moving out a decade ago. The apparel industry has been moving for a long time. The bigger, heavier industries, are still kind of stuck there, and the migration is more inside China, or they're finding just better, becoming more efficient in order not to have to move their production. The Pearl River Delta it's going to move. There's no doubt, right? And the fact is the minimum wages aren't going up 13% in those areas. They're going up 20%. And it's going to be a challenge for everybody to keep up with the migration, whether it's internally in China or outside, the China plus one strategy. It's one of the things that we started doing a long time ago. Right now, 50% of our production's in China. We're a Chinese company, right? And yet 50% of our production's outside of China. And it's been about that same percentage for the last 5 years. So it's happened. It's been happening over time. It's nothing that new.
As the demographic changes and does I was wondering if the buy power of China grows in the next 15 years, as previous presentation was shown, then would you say that in the apparel industry they have a sufficient supplies to meet those demands?
Are you talking China for China?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what will happen is that China obviously is going to go for higher value goods. If you put it into apparel terms, they'll go for higher value goods and apparel. And one interesting thing, when this whole Bangladesh tragedy happened, a lot of people pulled out or scaled back or kind of held their production in Bangladesh, and it was actually the Chinese who came in for Chinese consumed goods and took up a lot of that space in Bangladesh at that time. I think, yes, to answer your question, I think they'll have plenty of capacity to service internally, and I think there's a huge opportunity. And we've just kind of started this current 3-year plan we're in is really looking closely at China for China. A lot of the factories are getting set up to do it. They're wrapping their heads around that there's a big domestic market there, and it's relatively untapped. And the reality is the Chinese consumer now is really looking for higher quality goods. They're looking for, let's call it Western quality goods. And the factories that are already exporting have one step ahead with supplying that quality they're looking for, and I think the capacity will be there. Yeah.
Just a follow-up question, Michael. So when you say China for China, is this for the Western brand, or this is the domestic brand that'll be created as a generic offshoot?
Yeah, both. There's obviously lots of Western brands that are trying to get in there, and a lot of them are our existing customers. So they're looking at our company as kind of being a lead for producing and doing the distribution and controlling the IP. But also there's also domestic brands. Li Ning, we do some work for them. And I think that's one of the things we think, maybe not in this 3-year plan that we're in, but the next one, we think that Chinese brands are really going to make a leap forward and become globally important. And we think that's going to be an interesting trend to watch in the apparel luxury designer kind of arena.
I have a question that might be geared more towards Richard, but I'm just curious, what do you see as probably the largest obstacles for a U.S. company that's looking to start selling into China from an e-commerce perspective?
I think starting in China is always a challenge. It's not something that a lot of people run in there thinking they figured it out, not realizing that doing business in China is very different than doing business in the U.S. The rituals, the customs, the way relationships are built. And so from a cultural level and from an approach into China, a lot of people run in there and get tangled up and get hurt. So some of the obstacles that I'm seeing going into China, they've opened the free trade zone in Shanghai, which is something new, which is supposed to be a platform to help companies go into China, even tax-free, with some new opportunities. And so on an individual coming, if you wanted to bring a unique product into China, and working through a company, that takes time. Who you pick and how you pick them is difficult sometimes. But Amazon's got a brand new program that they've just announced, I think in February or March, where they will actually take the goods from U.S. manufacturers or suppliers in the U.S. They'll take them at their dock here. They'll handle all the customs paperwork, get it through into China, and get them into the pipeline in China. So Amazon just announced that. It's not up and running yet, but that's going to be a very easy avenue if you want to use Amazon. Now, they're only 12% of e-commerce in China. Alibaba and was it Taobao and Tmall have the vast majority of the e-commerce, but that's one avenue that I think is going to be real attractive to a lot of new people who are afraid to go in China, don't know what the risks are. If that answers your question.
So going back to the TPP question, there is also this RCEP in play, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is 16 countries driving in Singapore and the Asia. So how does this compare with the TPP?
I'm not sure I can answer. I'm not sure I can answer that.
Okay. There is this TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is competing with RCEP. So I was curious, but that's okay.
I have a question about the workforce in China and the other Southeast Asian nations. How are the companies preparing the workforce for the growth that you've seen?
Well, as the growth in what type of growth do you, the e-commerce, the China consumer purchasing growth?
Yeah, overall, manufacturing, planning, just overall.
There's a lot of pieces to that. The first is a lot of the, again, as Michael mentioned, and it's still going on, a lot of the low-end manufacturing is moving out and moving into places like Vietnam and Indonesia. And there's more capacity there. It's not a lot of capacity, but the wages are a third of what it is in China. There's no social tax, so that's opening up a channel. They're allowed to bring those goods back in, I believe, tax-free. So that's not an obstacle to overboarding some of that lower-end consumer products. But China is moving more towards mid and high-tech products as their focus, where there's bigger margins, as well as the service industry. So they're having to do more automation. They're having to retrain people into doing things like warehousing. A lot of the factories are built to order and not warehoused, or not handled local selling into the local market. So there's WOFEs over there which have only been able to manufacture and sell to the U.S., not back in China. So they're preparing, their factories will open up, and they're going to change their articles of incorporation, hopefully, to allow them to sell in the market as well. So some manufacturing that wasn't available into China will open up as well. I believe that's some of the trend.
I'd like to add a little color to that. You know, I think what we saw at Foxconn, I'm sure you guys remember all the suicides. There was a period of time where that was all happening, and everybody kind of just made the assumption that the workers are being abused, they weren't being paid enough, and really what it was that I think that China always traditionally had migrant labor force, coming from the farmlands in the north or wherever it was, and coming to the more developed, the south and stuff, and that kind of had changed. People were staying there, and they wanted a better quality of life. They didn't want to live in the dorms. They didn't want to eat in the factory cafeteria. And it's really a fundamental change. And Foxconn was one of the first to kind of realize that, because they had the big problem that they started, building nice housing for the workers, better food, internet connection for the stuff, child care built into the factories. All these things, I think that they're, it's not training them, but it's making a happy worker. They're staying there. They're not, at Chinese New Year, they're not running, 25 hours on a bus, back up north to, to go have a meal with their family. They're staying there. So the whole dynamic of the workforce has changed. I think it started because of that event. It was one of the linchpins for that change.
Recently, the federal government increased the tariffs on solar panel manufacturers in China. I was just wondering how these tariff increases affects companies that rely on Chinese manufactured products like solar panels in this case, and what are the various workarounds that perhaps you might have experienced companies are taking?
That's out of my scope, I guess.
I can add a little to that. Usually the tariffs are so prohibitive that it'll take China out of the market. They're not competitive in the U.S. There's other places that do make panels, and South Korea and other places that are competitive now with the tariffs in place. They put some tariffs in about 4 years ago for aluminum piping. They claimed there was some dumping going on in China for aluminum piping for the oil industry here. And so they put some heavy tariffs on that, and no longer can you buy extruded or seam tubing, aluminum tubing out of China without a 100% tariff, so it becomes not competitive. So they find other sources in the world, other places to make it not as cost effective as China pre-tariff, but there are workarounds and it does drive costs up.
So I have a question related to business ethics. So a lot of times I think we as American companies think that in Asia and ASEAN, people should work under our business ethics. Having been there for 25 years, you know that doesn't necessarily always correlate directly. And it's not really a question of business ethics, it's a different way of doing business. So how would you kind of characterize that, having been there 25 some years?
Yeah, I mean, Americans are Americans. They go in and they, enforce what they think is the right thing to do, and oftentimes it's at, it's certainly at conflict with the local laws or local regulations. It's a fine balance. We certainly have edicts internally at Li & Fung, and our customers have certain parameters of what they consider ethics, and then you have the regulations in the country or state that you're operating in. It's nothing I can really even give a hard answer on. It really depends on the scope of the customer and our internal policy at Li & Fung, and then the regulations of where you are operating that business. It seems now the world has become pretty transparent, and oftentimes now that, whether it's a 48-hour work week that's maximum or a 52-hour work week, they're often very close now in terms of regulation. We're not really running into too much discrepancy now enforcing the ethics of local people in conjunction with our customers' needs. It's not really it's a non-event for us at this point.
And if it's ethics or social compliance, I think it was the consumer that drove that, not necessarily the government that said, we want you to have no children working, pay overtime after 40 hours, or what's your limit hours on the week. It was a consumer that went to people like Nike and said, you have children in your factory, we're not going to buy your shoes. And it forced Nike to go to their factories and say it's either this way or the other way, and Target and all the others. Toys R Us was very stringent on toy safety And a lot of things that we think we were imposing, not as a country, but just as a consumer. I think that's how a lot of those ethics and changes were impacted.
Yeah, my point was it was the Western consumer. And so I think sometimes if you look, I'm a Westerner, I didn't grow up in this country though. So my question would be is as Asians have more and more buying power and become the consumer of choice in many cases, is the Western consumer necessarily the consumer of the future?
Oh, I don't, by volume, I don't believe so, right?
No.
Yeah, by volume, we'll never, once they surpass us, they probably won't be going back because it's just growing too fast. And there's other countries, India is on this very steep curve, so them combined with China would dwarf anything we will ever probably purchase from there.
So following up a little bit on this ethics issue, so can you say something about what are some of the main issues that you have with ethics and compliance in your industry? How, for instance, this Bangladesh disaster impacted your business?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really driven is one voice in the industry, especially I'll put it in apparel terms. The industry has kind of come together and really try to set some standards that are relatively flat. What happens is one of the big complaints, a lot of the factories over there, they get audit fatigue, they called it. The Walmart auditors would come in and say, put the fire extinguisher on this side of the door. And so they'd move it. And 2 weeks later, the Gap inspector would come in and say, no, it's got to be on the other side of the door. They'd move it. There was no clear standard. So what happened in the wake of Tazareen and Rana Plaza was that the industries, the European have their one and the U.S. kind of have their one, but they generally got together and came up with some rules of what is compliant. And on top of that, they've agreed in principle to honor anybody's audit. So if Gap says it's a compliant factory, then everybody in the coalition or the accord will then honor it. And conversely, if somebody blacklists a factory, it'll also be respected by everybody in the group. They won't use that factory. So it's forced a fundamental change in the factory's understanding of the importance of being ethical and compliant. Because if you're not anymore, I think within the Accord and the Alliance, the two big groups, I think it represents about, in Bangladesh, it represents close to 90% of the exports. So it's a powerful group, and it's forcing the change.
So if we look further, for instance, what do you think are some of the main supply chain risks that you see in your area, and how are you dealing with them? What do you do to mitigate them?
The whole issue of risk and risk management is a huge one. Recent surveys indicated that well over 50% of companies, large companies, are now very concerned about just the most fundamental risk, which is political instability across the world. There is less concern in Southeast Asia about the rise of serious risks in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, but it certainly is putting a huge chill on the market in the Eurozone countries and in the East Bloc countries. And that's something that pervades everything that happens, and so people get very concerned about making investments, so investment shrinks, and all the other economic negative issues come to play. So that's one in particular. At the same time, there's a lot of optimism when the world took a look at what happened after the Japanese tsunami, backed up by flooding in Thailand. And I forget what the third whammy was, but it was very interesting response from that. Within 2 years, much of the effect of that had basically gone away, and actually within a very few months of the initial event, industry was able to readjust and accommodate even a massive event or pair of events like these very once-in-a-lifetime kinds of things. And it's sort of a measure of the resilience of the supply chain as it's now structured. And we're getting much, much better, having faced these events, we're much, much better about building highly resilient supply chains. So as people focus on those risks, they realize, well, it's not so bad. And as we now refine the procedures, the ability of the supply chain to reconfigure itself and to be very flexible, I think, is actually in pretty good shape and getting better. And as you leverage technology more and more, it gets better and better.
One of the other changes I'm seeing in China is China's focus on the U.S. as a primary client for their products. What they're now doing is they're expanding their relationships, particularly with Russia, with the gas line. They are talking about the new maritime Silk Road, which would be a shipping channel between Sri Lanka and India and China. So opening up more supply chain avenues for them and taking some of the risk out of being just primarily a Western country manufacturing for Western products. They're also talking about a Silk Road to Europe, which would be actually a highway where along the road different countries and different cities would be able to build and manufacture and contribute to the supply chain. The problem with the road from China into Europe is there's some rough neighborhoods they have to go through, and right now that's probably not going to be happening in the short term, but that's one of their focus is somewhere else now. It's moving on, it's bringing on more clients and more customers.
What do you think their ability is? How resilient is their economy to shock, both internally and externally as well? Is it? I think some people think it's fairly fragile. I mean, if a significant shock, it could have some big impacts. Or I think, or as you said, they've been able to absorb quite a bit in the past as well. So.
Yeah, like a natural disaster, an economic, monetary shock, or.
I mean, anything that would be significant to the economy, maybe cause a slowdown that would keep them from, maintaining a growth rate.
Well, there's several factors internal to China which are challenging for the Chinese government and Chinese people. One-child policy, right? It's the aging population. That's going to trend where each child is responsible for up to 6 adults for their well-being. They've got an environmental issue which is creating a little unrest in China, a little discontent in parts of China. The people want something better. There's still the haves and have-nots in China. And so political unrest is still, it's a potential, although we don't see it happening. China's very good at controlling a lot of that. But there are parts of the country, their kids don't have the nice schools. They don't go to the universities. They don't have the good medical programs. And they know it because they came to the East Coast and worked in all those factories and saw the Lamborghinis and all the really high-end stuff and the great food and the great choices, and they go home and they don't have it. So there's still that uncomfort in China. So can they survive? They've got a lot of internal challenges. They've got 1.3 billion people. They're faced with Western exposure to openness and democracy, and they don't have that, and they don't necessarily ask for it. But there's times they wish they had it, and so we'll see. They've been through 27 different dynasties or ruling eras. We hope to never see anything like that again. But China has a period has breaking points in their history, and so we'll see.
So on a completely different topic, do you guys see any kind of this trend of increasing data analytics, business analytics happening in US having an impact in China? Do you see more use of data analytics in your companies, in your area?
We're just as a company just starting to dig into it. We have, I think, 15,000 factories in our database that we work with, and we have about 8,000 customers. And we know that there's a wealth of information. You know, I think I don't know. Don't hold me to this, but I've heard that 40% of the apparel in the U.S. goes through Li and Feng. So you can only imagine the information that we have in our database, you know, coming from the supplier and the end user, the retailer or the brand. And it's something we know is really important, and we've hired some bright people out of Silicon Valley who've now living in Hong Kong, and we're just really on the front end of it. We know it's something special, and it's a real value unlock. And to be frank, we haven't really completed our strategy yet on how we're going to use that to the benefit of our vendors as well as our customers.
And we had some great presentations today, I think, that talked about a lot of those things. The problem with data in China is it's hard to get to. A lot of it's controlled, and a lot of the data you get may not be accurate. So that's part of the challenge of dealing with that in China. Over time, it will get better. My experience is they're 12 to 18 months behind what trends in this area we follow here, but it won't be long before people like Alibaba figure this out, and they're already in the hunt for this and figure out what their consumers want and manage that data accordingly.
There is, I think, one of the areas that is often overlooked is that much of what you hear about big data is really oriented towards retail sales, where the huge value lies is just starting to be discovered, and that's in the use of big data for managing the supply chains. McKinsey has some very interesting reports that have come out recently about the impact of those kinds of things. And I think the value for supply chain visibility and management and measurement and all is actually much, much higher with big data on the business side as opposed to just on the retail side.
And so since we have quite a few students in the audience, can you tell us something about what kind of supply chain professionals do you think are needed in your area? So what should they try to get more expertise in?
Yeah, you know, one of the things we looked at, we just finished our brainstorming management meeting in Hong Kong about a month ago, and we think really the supply chain is, from our perspective, our world, is changing. It's going to become more customized, smaller. We think the days of the huge production runs where you're making 1 million pieces for Walmart or Target, we think that'll still continue at some level, but we think that it's going to be really the people who can be small and agile, who can change their production line, you know, from 1 week to the next, smaller runs, really reacting to what the consumer wants, what the trends, and it's going to be all about speed and agility. So we think that's going to be a real skill going forward in what we see as the consumer area we play as being a huge advantage. You know, we work with the likes of the Walmarts and stuff, and you know that business will continue. They'll still want to make their chino, their cotton chino, 5 million pieces, 2 colors. And but really what's happening is, I think with the internet too, there's so many channels to sell now, and the runs are going to be very small. They're going to demand to have it in with the buyer or with the customer in shorter periods of time. So it's that agility, and to manage that agility and the complexity that comes with having to change on a dime like that. That's going to be, we think, a big driver going forward in our world.
And I think as Chinese factories, we have this ASEAN free trade agreement where they can go to, again, Vietnam and those nearby countries for production. We're going to have factories outsourcing either for raw materials or components. Factory owners are going to have to change their model, and they're going to have to, as I said, they're going to have to warehouse. They're going to have to hire professionals within Chinese factories who can do global sourcing, who've never done that, who can warehouse, who can inventory, who can plan and schedule. Those jobs are going to come of age in China as they get ready to build their a lot of products offshore, bring them in, and then redistribute them within China.
Do we have any more questions in the audience? Okay, so Do you guys have anything else to say that I didn't ask you about?
Yeah, there's one initiative that I think is quite interesting that Li and Feng is going after in this 3-year plan, and we always looked as our customer being the brands and the retailers, and we took a look back and we said we're working with 15,000 unique factory suppliers, and they should also be our customers. So we set up a whole division over the last probably 8 months that's really now reaching out to our suppliers and providing them services, whether it's lean manufacturing consulting, whether it's sustainability, whether it's ethics training for their staff, for their management, whether it's helping them with production flow of raw materials. So we've now kind of flipped the switch and said not only are our traditional customers our customers, but really our suppliers have now become our customers, trade finance, all these things, warehousing, peak capacity planning for them. And that's really kind of been a new buzzword at our company that, there's value add on the supplier side of our business model as well. We think that's going to be a kind of a revenue driver. It's just ramping up now, but it'll be something interesting to watch to see how much value we can bring to the supplier community.
I just want to add as the middle class explodes in China and all across Southeast Asia, all those folks have lots and lots of money. So there's 2 huge trends that are going to emerge that are not necessarily often talked about in the supply chain community. One is mega money. There's huge amounts of money being made in Asia and not necessarily very efficient ways to put it to good use. So there's lots of money flowing through the banks, but financial services colliding with Chinese and other Southeast Asian cultures makes for a very interesting outlook for the financial business. How does all that money get managed, and where does it go? And another one that we often don't talk about is agribusiness, feeding the folks. And I don't mean the restaurant business, I mean simply feeding folks. So there's huge opportunities all across China for stuff that we here in the US take for granted. We have lots of chickens, and we have lots of cattle, and we have lots of infrastructure to support that. Not much of that exists in China. Much of it is imported. As I understand it, Tyson in China processes 3 million chickens a week, and it's growing at about 18% a year. And that's just on the chicken side. Whether it's whole chickens or feed or whatever, there's lots of great stories about the chicken feed. But apart from that, it's huge opportunity in cattle. And huge opportunities in whole milk, and huge opportunities in every other area, but those are the big ones that really are a problem. And that, of course, has implications for other resources, water. And if you have all those cattle, what are they going to eat? China doesn't have a huge history of growing large amounts of hay. In fact, one of the major exports of the United States is hay to China, which drives up the price of hay here, creates all kinds of problems, and hay requires lots of water, and there's all sorts of odd things that happen like that. But you want to make a whole bunch of money, head west, very west, over into China and figure out how to provide food for this exploding population, which now has lots of money to buy better stuff.
One last comment on the end of the supply chain. That's the delivery of products. We saw some presentations today about next day delivery and how the U.S., and depends on the brand, where they are, how fast they can get next day delivery out. Well, in the bigger cities in China, next day delivery is no longer good enough. They're now wanting 4 to 8 hours delivery. And they have capability to do that with a lot of their, I guess they call last mile delivery, the small scooters can go out. So that will be a trend in China that will be ahead of everybody else. Same day, 4 to 8 hour delivery is within reach very soon. Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I would like to thank our panel. I hope, although you had a panel full of white people talking about China, you managed to get some interesting and informative answers.